So I think that we are live now. I would like to wish a good afternoon to all our colleagues that joined us here. I would like also to wish a good evening to Norbert Waszek, Professor Norbert Waszek, that is here with us today. It is a great pleasure to welcome all you here and to welcome also our guest professor for our second seminar on Hegel and politics, new perspectives. The first seminar was about 15 days ago. It was with Lisa Herzog, and now we are going to proceed to our second one. This series of seminars are organized around our online journal of Hegelian studies. In Portuguese, we say it a Revista Eletrônica de Estudos Hegelianos. This series is specifically based on the last two issues. They are not the last ones. The two issues of Hegel and politics, new perspectives. The one was published in 2018. The other one was published in 2019. They aim to promote this series of web seminars is to discuss these works and studies about Hegel's political philosophy, mainly departing from the themes that were treated in the works that we published in these two issues. So today we have here with us Professor Norbert Waszek. I will introduce him in a moment. I need only to remember that we will have for the next month also other professors here with us in this series, such as Professor Frank Huda in the 17th November at 3 p.m. 3 p.m. Brazil. Here in Brazil, we are always about 5 hours behind Paris, Berlin, or Netherlands. And then we will have on the 17th December Paula Arentes at 7:30 p.m. here in Brazil. If you want to follow our whole program, you can find it in our Facebook webpage or also in the webpage of our online journal of Hegelian studies. I also need to mention that these seminars are being organized by my colleagues, the editors of the issues of Hegel and politics. Who I will ask to present themselves for our attendees. So I would like to ask first Poliana to make a brief introduction of herself. So Poliana.
Yeah, hello everyone. Good afternoon, good evening to Professor Waszek. I'm Poliana Chidri. I'm postdoc researcher at Unicinos University and at the philosophy faculty of this university. I'm also, as Ricardo said, the editor, one of the editors of the journal Hegelian Studies. And it's a great pleasure to have Professor Waszek here with us today. I will hand over to Manu,
yes.
Manuel Nakamura, if you would like to present yourself.
Hi, I am Emmanuel Nakamura. I am also a postdoc student, but at Unicamp in Campinas. And I am also editor from the journal Estudos Hegelianos. Nice to see you here, Norbert Waszek.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much, Manu. So I will now ask our special guest to introduce herself also for you. Eveline is PhD in USP, and she's also a translator of one of the articles that Norbert published in Brazil. So I will hand over to Eveline also.
Thanks, Ricardo. Thanks for the invitation. I would like to thank you, Norbert, for being here as well. And good afternoon for everybody.
So finally, before starting the lecture, I will only want to reassure some technical issues about how the our seminar is going to work. So I will soon hand over to Professor Waszek. He will have up to 45 minutes to his presentation, and afterwards I will open to the debate. The attendees that are here with us in Teams or in Facebook can also write down their questions anytime, if possible in English. If there are people that want to write down also in Portuguese, we can try to translate it to Professor Norbert. You can find the button, the chat button, if you are in Teams. The chat button is in the bar here below. You can write down pressing the button. I would also like to inform for those interested that we are providing certificates for these seminars. You have just to fill in the form. I think that Andressa, that is giving us a technical support, has made it available in the chat. And finally, I would like to also make a very brief introduction of our guest here for this lecture. So we have the great pleasure to welcome Professor Norbert Waszek. He is a professor at the Département d'études germaniques of the Paris University, Université Paris 8. He's sorry, Norbert. Eight. Okay. His research encompasses a very diversified branch of issues. I will only mention some of them: the Scottish Enlightenment, the formation of the young Hegel, the history of economy, the Hegel school, especially Edward Kant's, Heinrich Heine, and many other issues also. I will restrict myself to list the books that he published more directed related to Hegel or the Hegelian school. So he published the Scottish Enlightenment and Hegel's account of civil society in 1991. He also published a book on Eduard Ganz in German called Eduard Ganz Rückblicke auf Personen und Zustände. He also was the editor of one book on Hegel and Saint-Simonism, the theme of the lecture today, that is called precisely Hegelianismus und Saint-Simonismus. It was published in 2007. And we are also very pleased to have already some articles of Professor Norbert translated into Portuguese. So we publish in our journal in this issue, Hegel and Politics, from 2019, Eduard Ganz, sobre pobreza e o debate constitucional. The original title is Eduard Ganz on Poverty and Constitutional Debate. Then before that, we published also O Mendigo Escocês de Hegel in 2018. Recently, it was published in our journal called Revista de Filosofia Aurora, an article entitled História e Economia em Hegel e Kant, translated by Eveline, that is here with us. And before that, Norbert also had another article translated into Portuguese in the journal Opinião Filosófica. The article is called O Estatuto da Economia Política na Filosofia de Hegel. So for those who want to see the vertiginous list of works authored by Professor Norbert Waszek, more than 150 papers. We have written here in the chat, I think, the professor's website, that is norbertwaszek.free.fr. So I need also to say that considering the time frame limitation that we have, sorry. I will like also to say that again, reinforce that we are very pleased to have Professor Norbert here with us today. Unfortunately, this time it was not personally. He gave us the honor to welcome him in Brazil last year, but the conditions imposed this situation to us, and we can at least have this opportunity to discuss your work with you again today. So I give yet the floor to Professor Norbert Waszek to start his presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, can you all hear me? No problem. It's a pleasure to be with you, not in person this time, and I was very grateful in 2019, only just over a year ago, but it seems so far away now. Anyway, in 2019 to come to São Paulo and also to Porto Alegre. When Ricardo invited me, we discussed a little about the topic, and then he saw this book that came out in 2007. I didn't edit it alone, with my colleagues and friends, Schmidt-Ambusch, Ludwig Sieb, Etama. And so he thought this might be of interest to you. The subject, he said, is not so known. And so we settled on this. But of course, I shall try to bring in also some more recent material, things I have written since 2007 on Hegel school and so on. So I begin by way of introduction. Hegelianism and Saint-Simonism, how did I come to the subject? Many years ago, I think it was in 1983, Iring Fetscher, I met him at a conference, and he said, I'm doing a big handbook on the history of political ideas. Wouldn't you like to write something on Hegel's school? So, of course, at the time I was young and after publication, so I said, yes, of course, I'll do it. And during this, when I was working on this, I discovered Eduard Ganz. I wrote his name and date also in the chat. And in a way, it was Ganz who brought me to the subject. On the one hand, he was, of course, an eminent Hegelian. He edited Hegel's philosophy of history, and from the scratch, because there wasn't much text by Hegel himself on the basis of the students' notes. And he also edited the second edition of Hegel's philosophy of right, 1833, which has the special feature for the first time that he edited additions to the text that were also based on the explanations that Hegel had given on the paragraphs of his text during his lectures, when he was lecturing on it. So on the one hand, Ganz was an eminent Hegelian, one might say. In the few years that he outlived Hegel, Hegel died in 31, Ganz already in 39, when he was still fairly young. But in those few years, one might say he was something of a leader of the Hegelian school. And Ganz was not just a Hegelian, he was also an important figure in the early German reception of Saint-Simonian thought. Okay, because in a text that he published in 1836, he had, well, it was more a book of autobiography, Rückblicke, you look backward on your life and so on, although he was still young. And this book is structured chronologically, and he has a visit to Paris in 1825, in 1830, and so on. The one on 1830, his visit to Paris, includes a longish passage, some 10 pages in the printed book, on the Saint-Simonians, saying I hadn't much heard about them, and then I came to Paris and I met some of the people and I learned this and that about them. Okay, so in a way I was brought to the subject via Eduard Ganz, his double interests in the French social thought of his time, and also, of course, an eminent Hegelian. Then I became aware of the fact that he was not the only Hegelian that took an active interest in Saint-Simon, Fourier, other figures on the, at the time, new social thought in France. And then, so one day we wanted to work together, the three people, my co-editors, who at the time were all at the University of Münster, and myself in Paris, and then we got a grant to do more on this subject, and the book, in a way I had shown to you, came out of this. So this by way of introduction. Now I have already mentioned Gans and others, like a man called Carové, were Hegelians, came from Hegel, and also played leading role in the German reception of Saint-Simonism. And I found that already, and this is the, excuse me, my wife will take the phone, already the contemporaries showed some awareness that there was an affinity, a resemblance, a closeness between Hegel's thought and Saint-Simonian thought. I give you just two examples from Germany. So this is the first point. I have 7 points. I try not to be much longer than 9 o'clock. In 7 points, the first point is that the contemporaries were aware of an affinity between the two schools. The first example, and it is an important one from Germany, is the famous Staatslexikon, a kind of a dictionary of political science in many volumes, and one volume that came out in 1839 says that Saint-Simonism is a school that was largely defended and propagated by Hegelians in the stricter or in the wider sense of the word. I translate a bit from German, but that's what it is. So something that seemed to link them. The second example, and of course the Staatslexikon edited by Waszek and Welker, was an important, not just academic work, it was also important for the political life in Germany during that period. So already in this dictionary, the two schools were brought together. The second example is from Heinrich Heine, from his famous History of Religion and Philosophy in Germany, published first as articles and then as a book in 1835. There too, Heine says that the Saint-Simonians came close to what he calls the philosophers of identity, and that at the time for him was an allusion to the young Schelling and the young Hegel when they were still cooperating, philosophy of identity. And he says sometimes the Saint-Simonians come close to what the German philosophers thought at the time. So these are two important texts, I think, that testify to this early association between the two schools. I have also already mentioned Carové, who was an early student in Hegel's Heidelberg years and followed Hegel to Berlin, and he was the one who translated already in 1831, 1 year after the publication of the French original, a book, Doctrine of Saint-Simon, which was a collective work that brought together the central aspects of Saint-Simonian thought. And donc Carové, disciple and close follower of Hegel, was the one who translated that French collection of texts 1 year only after the French original. I can then, another way of putting this, I'm still in my first point, another way of putting is that a lot of contemporaries said that Saint-Simonian thought is an emanation, something that sprang up from idealistic thought. And sometimes, for example, in Carouet, the first translator of Saint-Simonian doctrine, this goes as far as accusing the Saint-Simonians of having plagiarized Hegel and other German philosophers. They also mention Fichte, they also mention Krauss, and so on. But, and of course, Pierre Leroux, a kind of early socialist figure in France, but a follower more of Schelling than of Hegel, he also pointed to the affinity between Hegelianism and Saint-Simonism, saying it is clear that Prosper Enfantin, one of the Saint-Simonians, that his metaphysics is clearly Hegelian. He wrote that already in his text on Schelling, on the Cours de Schelling, published Leroux's summary in 1842. There is a German translation of it somewhere. Anyway, these few points, first step in my argument, the contemporaries seem to be aware and articulated a kind of closeness and affinity between the two schools. Well, second point, why have I said Hegelianism and Saint-Simonism, and why do I not speak about Hegel himself or Saint-Simon himself? Well, Hegel was, towards the end of his life, he became aware of Saint-Simonian thought. For example, there was a review of this collection of Saint-Simonian essays that was published in 1830 when Hegel was still around. In the review that he co-directed, of which he was the Spiritus Rector, the Jahrbücher für wissenschaftliche Kritik, the Annals of Scientific Criticism. Some people say the Hegel's review, but anyway, close to Hegel and to his school. 1830, a review of Saint-Simonism was published there, and of course Carouet, his former student, also presented Hegel with a copy of his translation. We no longer have Hegel's library, of course. It was auctioned off when Hegel died, shortly after. The family needed the money, seems, but we have the catalogue, and the catalogue has recently been re-edited, and you can check whatever Hegel had, whatever book Hegel had in his private library, even though we don't have the actual books. We have the auction catalogue. So there is some proof that Hegel, towards the end of his life, was aware that something was going on in France and so on. But if you look closer, of course, it's not Hegel himself who had a great interest in this. It is rather that his interest was awakened and aroused by some of his disciples. Gans, who came back from Paris and told all the details to Hegel, Carouet and others, Michelet, other disciples of Hegel that brought this material to Hegel. It was not so much himself. And then, of course, even though Hegel was perhaps somewhat aware of Saint-Simonian thought towards the end of his life, it came too late to interact with his thought. It was too late to be integrated into his system, so it remains on the margin of his thought. On the other hand, his students took a more active interest and took matters further. The same might be said for Saint-Simonism. Saint-Simon died in 1825, and at the time of his death, he was not very well known. He was rather, his reputation was rather limited. But as was the case with Hegel, he had active disciples that continued the work. Like, you might say, like Hegel's disciples who have edited all the posthumously the lecture notes on the aesthetics, on the philosophy of history, and so on. In the same way, the Saint-Simonians, after the death of their founding figure, edited this text, Doctrine of Saint-Simon, and in 1829-30, and they brought together and they propagated this in several ways. They also created journals, and they also presented public lectures on the basis of this collection, Doctrine de Saint-Simon. So it is really the link, the connection between the two currents of thought is rather one that was realized by the schools of the two founding figures, not so much by the two, by Hegel and Saint-Simon himself. Now, this was the second point, and I'm using this also to say a bit more about a philosophical school in general. Now we hear this nowadays, Frankfurt School and so on. What makes a school a school? It's not just a great thinker. The great thinker has to have disciples that continue his work and that propagate it beyond the narrow circle. And often this happens in through several generations. You might say Gans, Rosenkranz, Michelet, etc. They were disciples of Hegel, and then in their turn they continued to teach upon Hegelian principles, and often using Hegel's book as the textbook for the class. This happened often, and so another generation came along, and they also were raised in Hegelian thought. You might think, of course, of Marx, but of many others. Marx was too young to be a student of Hegel, but he could, of course, study with Hegel's disciples. And so a school that the ideas, the values of a thinker are transmitted from one generation to another. And of course, this implies that some of the disciples became professors in their turn and continued thus the work. The same, in a way, might be said of Saint-Simon, even though he was not a university figure and his disciples were not often university figures. Some of them were or became eventually, but it was not a kind of institutional continuity in, like in Berlin, when you can have 3, 4, 5 professors that were students of Hegel. Another feature that often belongs to a school, and is certainly true for Hegel's school and also for Saint-Simon, is that the disciples take the defense of the master, the late master who is no longer there. So you, for example, for Hegel, you have several books by Rosenkranz, by Michele and others that have apology in the title. Eine Apologie Hegels gegen die Vorwürfe von Heim und so weiter. Donc a trend to whenever the master is attacked, the disciples get up and defend him. This is also true for Saint-Simon, and in a way, it's also true for the Frankfurt School. When Adorno was attacked, Habermas tried to defend him, and so on. What also happened in both cases, schools have a tendency to split up. Why should this be so? Because once the master is no longer there and can say a decisive word about an issue, well, then there will be quarrels between the school, and a separation or a split of the school is in a way prepared already. Okay, so I come back. I can speak longer if the questions come or if I find the time about Hegel's school and his specificities. I had said third point that Hegel became aware of Saint-Simonian thought, but this came too late, and the interaction between the two schools only took place amongst the disciples on the one hand of Hegel and on the other hand of Saint-Simon. But fourth point is nevertheless Hegel's disciples were prepared for an opening towards Saint-Simonism. I shall try to explain this in the following way. Now, you are aware of the fact that Hegel, especially in the section on civil society, in his philosophy of right and also in the encyclopedia, he analyzed civil society, and in parts with the help of the classical political economists. He mentions himself, Smith, Say, Ricardo, in one of the early paragraphs of the section on needs, system of needs on civil society. But Hegel also came to analyze this economy critically, and he shows that within this civil society there are problems, and especially that poor people are systematically, not accidentally, not by contingence or by accident, but are systematically produced. And of course, this begged for an answer. And Hegel discusses, still in the section on civil society, different solutions to the question. Hegel himself does not yet speak of the social question, but the term comes up with people that were again close to Hegel. If you check it up in geschichtliche Grundbegriffe, you will find that they will tell you that one of the first Germans to use the term soziale Frage, the social question, was indeed Heine. When he reported on France from Paris, he wrote articles on France for German papers that he later brought together under books like Conditions in France and so on, französische Zustände. Okay, donc there Heine uses soziale Frage, and another one, also kind of second generation Hegelian, Lorenz von Stein, also speaks centrally about die soziale Frage. What I'm trying to say with this, it's not about lexicography, it's about the fact that Hegel's disciples, by Hegel's treatment of the what he didn't yet call social questions, but of the problems of civil society, they were kind of prepared to look for new answers. And it is for me, in this perspective, that they turned to new French social thought. I could say more in this context about in what sense this transfer is kind of typical for an intellectual transfer, for the transfer of ideas. You know, the anecdote about Heine, he came to the German border from France, one of the rare visits when he came back, and the customs were searching his suitcases, and he kind of turns around and said, the contraband is in my head, it's not in the suitcase. So what I'm smuggling is in my head, it's not to be found in the suitcase. So it's an example of these ideas circulated, and you have, in fact, in this period, 1830, 1840s, you have a high time of intellectual transfer between France and Germany, with all the classical components you find in studies on intellectual transfer. You have the mutual visits. Cousin comes to Germany, Gans goes to Paris, Heine is already in Paris, and so on. You have what follows from first mutual visits. You have rich correspondences. I mean, friends of mine, Espagne and Michael Werner, have once edited the German letters to Cousin, but there are many more, with only a selection. I think the Sorbonne has some 30,000 letters to Cousin. So what I'm trying to say is only that you had, after the mutual visits, you had correspondences, and what follows from the correspondences is that you have mutual aid with publications of the kind, you know, my dear cousin, I'm sending you my new book, can't you have it reviewed in France, and so on. So all these examples of cultural transfer are well represented in this case. But, and yeah, I'm getting there by 9 o'clock. Of course, the reception of the two currents, the mutual reception, the Saint-Simonians reading Hegel and the Hegelians reading Saint-Simon, was always extremely selective. They picked and chose what would be convenient to them. You see, for example, that different German visitors to France have identified completely different aspects, or have put the emphasis on very different aspects of Saint-Simonian thought. For example, Heine liked the idea that the Saint-Simonians at one point tried to transform their ideas into a new religion. Heine thought this was a good idea, whereas Gans, for example, he says, oh, this was a silly idea. He doesn't put it like that, but he means it. He says this was superfluous. They should have stuck to their analysis of bourgeois society and not turn to religion to transform society. So the reception is always selective. You might say this is a question of the individual people that went to another country and that read the relevant texts, but it is probably also a question of how to adapt a theory to another country. So Heine thought new religion great, and Gans thought, no, this is not interesting, but we can find interesting points in their analysis of society. In fact, he says, we already have a history of class antagonisms elaborated in the Saint-Simonian texts, and Gans sums that up, and in fact in the Communist Manifesto it's not so very different, as Jonathan Sperber in his recent book on Marx, when you have the English edition, in the German one it doesn't come out so neatly. They had kind of two blocks of texts, one next to the others, one by Gans and one by Marx, and he could have added a third one because much of this comes also from Saint-Simon. Okay, so receptive reading, which does create problems at one point or another, but I want to come closer to my conclusion and say, well, now he told us much about the history of ideas, how French ideas came to Germany and the other way around. This is all very nice, but what's the interest of it? Why should this be still looked at today? I think that the interesting point is that this brief but important interaction between two schools was conducive, helped, to put it differently, helped to create new ideas in social philosophy. So it's not just something historical, it has its contemporary relevance. I only try to explain this very briefly. Again, the example of Gans. Now you can read all my the article on Gans in Brazilian, which first came out in Cambridge. And what I'm trying to say there about Gans is that he uses the Hegelian category and concept of corporations, but he is trying to integrate into this Hegelian conception of corporations the Saint-Simonian idea of association. And the result of this is that you arrive, at least that is my interpretation, maybe I'm trying to get too much out of these relatively short texts. As I see it, he develops a kind of synthesis out of Hegelian's corporation and the association in Saint-Simon, in the Saint-Simonians, to come to something like modern trade unions. At least, he says, if we have such associations, they can do collective bargaining, they can negotiate, and so on. And it is important that the lower levels of societies get organized and can, via these corporations, associations, they can articulate themselves, articulate their specific interests. This seems to be something that is fairly new at the time. There were no trade unions, or almost none, in Germany. And what Gans kind of developed out of this. The other example, and this is more a second generation Hegelian, Lorenz Stein, who later became von, but we leave it like that. Lorenz Stein was also, like Marx, too young to study with Hegel, but he did go to Berlin with a scholarship for a year to study with Hegelians. and he, like Marx, maybe they sat in the same class, or almost. Stein also listened to Gans, and then Stein went to Paris with another scholarship for 18 months, and when he came back, he produced this book, Der Sozialismus und Kommunismus im heutigen Frankreich, Socialism and Communism in French contemporary life. Okay, and in Lorenz von Stein, you have there, you find a summary, maybe not more, I would say more, but at least a summary of Saint-Simonian thought. And also, I think the two heritages he got, the one from Hegel's school, the one from Saint-Simon, helped Lorenz von Stein to become a kind of forerunner of the social state. This is not so revolutionary, but it is progressive compared with the time in which he found himself in. Well, it's almost 45 minutes. I think I shall stop here, and I'll be happy to go back and to elaborate points that I have perhaps made too briefly.
Ricardo, your microphone is on mute.
Okay.
I unmute.
Okay, I unmuted it. Not any longer muted. Okay, thank you, Professor Norbert, for this amazing exposition. I would like to start before handing over to our chats, our colleagues that are here with us in the backstage. I will like to also direct a question to you, and I would allow myself to try to make a rather general question, a question more like I would like to say on some principles of how to deal with the history of philosophy, because what I think that is really astonishing in your work is how you very convincingly demonstrate how the institutions have a very important role on determining the legacy of a thinker like Hegel. So the way that you explores all the, let me say like that, all the strategy of Hegel to form his disciples and have a journal to publish his works and the works of, let's say, people with whom he can make some alliances, and also the importance of the personal relation that Hegel has to some high civil servants of the Prussian state, for instance, the Minister of Culture, Kaufenstein, soon Altenstein, and also Johannes Schulze. I mean, all this strategy or all these institutional elements that are so valuable to make the reproduction and the dissemination of Hegelian thought is very well demonstrated. And after reading that, we get very skeptical about a history of philosophy that is reconstructed on debates concerning concepts. Like, okay, the Hegelian school was overcome, let's say like that, because Hegel or his disciples were refuted, you know. Do you think that there is a competition on the principles of how to read the history of philosophy? Do you have a position, a settled position that the history of philosophy should rather be reconstructed, having the main tenet in the relation with institutions, or is there, let me say, a way to conjoin, to conciliate both principles? The principle of the concept, how you refute a concept, and the principle of how the institutions are important to the philosophy, to the history of philosophy.
Yeah, plenty of questions already. I answer now, yes. Of course, you know, Liza Hill, in the beginning of her book, she says, there's only one man who has written on this. It's Norbert Waszek. It's very nice, but it's all too historical. And so that I was not using systematic arguments. I have already told her once, I would never have spent so much time on the history of it if I hadn't had a systematic interest in the question. So, but that's in brackets. Of course, the institution now. A philosophical debate you can always have, you know, is Aristotle greater than Plato? You can always discuss that. But to see how a historical figure like Hegel imposed himself only during a short period of time, you need to take into account other aspects. And I think indeed that he had also a strategic mind. He knew how to put guns into the law faculty, and he discussed it with Schulz, and we wait till the crown prince is not in Berlin, and so on. They used cunning to impose guns. And also the thing was the journal. The question was important, the issue was important to Hegel. He only had a journal, very briefly, Kritisches Journal. He had very briefly with Schelling when they were young in Jena. And all his life, I think Hegel wanted to have another journal. And why is that important? Because it brings the people together. They work together. So it is on the one hand more cohesion within the school. They work together, they stick together, and so on. And it is, of course, also a platform to make the point of view of the school visible and audible outside of the school. Then, of course, one must not exaggerate the point either, because then people will say, Hegel was the philosopher of the Prussian state and so on. He could only profit from this advantage during a very short period of time. And then, of course, Altenstein and Schulze and the king changed in 1840. And then there was a kind of rollback. They didn't want to have the Hegelians anymore. And the most dramatic case is probably Bruno Bauer being kicked out of Bonn University. And as I always think, if this had not happened, Marx might have become a professor and we wouldn't have heard about him anymore. I'm exaggerating a bit, but when Marx realized that the gates of the Prussian universities were closed to him, well, he looked for other perspective. He went to Cologne to edit the journal, and then he went to Paris and so on. The institutional framework of philosophical ideas is important. So, and maybe one last issue, and then I like to ask other questions. I've also, in a more recent paper, tried to spell out why was it just the case with Hegel that you have such a school that lasted for a few decades anyway. Difficult to say when it stopped. As I tried to argue in another paper, it is the encyclopedic structure of Hegel's system. He tried to cover all the fields, and he could only do so in an outline, im Grundriss, etc. Donc, an Abriss, pardon, Abriss. Donc, this opened for his disciples the possibility to choose one aspect and to become a master in his own field, like Ganz, who turned to law and wrote massive histories of law, universal history of the laws of heritage or succession. Okay, and others turned to other disciplines, Hoto to art, history of art, and this in a way was introduced, was made possible by Hegel's encyclopedia. They could, no single individual could handle all these disciplines. And already at the time, Rosenkranz has an interesting passage somewhere hidden in his biography of Hegel, where he says other philosophers didn't need companions and apprentices, like in a Handwerker, an artisan who has first an apprentice and then a companion. And so Hegel's philosophy was in need, says Rosenkranz, of such helpers in a way that Descartes and others he mentions did not need. Okay, already too much in the answer. I don't hear you. I can't hear you. You have to change the microphone. I can't hear anybody.
Sorry.
Okay.
I always forget that. So thank you very much. It's really very interesting your approach to reconstruct the Hegel school. It seems sometimes when you are speaking about it, that it is almost a forerunner of interdisciplinary research. So I like very much all the time that you make comparisons about the Frankfurt School, because in Frankfurt School you have this project in the very let's say heart of the Frankfurt School, a project of interdisciplinary research, the importance also of a journal to have broader impact of the philosophical positions or the theoretical positions, the researchers, the empirical researchers. So it is really very stimulating to see all these similarities. But okay,
like Hegel had his Jahrbuch für wissenschaftliche Kritik, the Frankfurt School has its Zeitschrift für Sozialforschung. It's they also saw the need to create an organ to publicize their ideas.
Precisely. So I would like also to hand over to maybe Poliana or Manuel or Eveline, anyone that wants to also ask a question to Professor Waszek. So please, I hand over to Eveline.
Thanks, Ricardo. Thanks, Norbert. I have a more detailed question on an issue you mentioned. It's on the idea, the Saint-Simonian idea of association. Mm-hmm. And then taking Edward Gans as an author who somehow synthesized the Hegelian and Saint-Simonian elements, as you say, as you put it, on your article. The article Ricardo mentioned, published in Brazil. I would like to listen you to speak, to say a little bit more about the similarities between Gans' cooperation and the Saint-Simonian approach to association. I tend to see more differences than similarities. If you can speak a little bit more about it.
Yes, of course. I mean, there are also significant differences between the two schools. To mention perhaps the most important ones that also comes out in the few pages of Gans is the question of private property, and related to private property, the law of inheritance. Nowadays we might think, oh, few lawyers will study law of inheritance. It's a small subsection of law. Very few professional lawyers will specialize in it. Why were they all so excited about it? Because the law of inheritance will organize how private property is passed on from one generation to the next. That was the issue, why they paid attention to it. And of course, the Saint-Simonians, not all of them wanted to do away with private property, but they thought it was useful to have a clear cut between each generation, and so that you couldn't have people that never work and that only live off their heritage. So they really wanted to, at the end of each generation, to have a clear cut and not to perpetuate the accumulated private property. Of course, from a Hegelian point of view, this is not so acceptable, because Hegel was convinced that freedom, which was for him of the greatest importance, needs to be realized also with respect to the free disposition of property. So he was not favorable to cut after each generation and to socialize, in a sense, the property accumulated by the elder generation. But I would not like to present myself as they are saying they have everything in common. No, there are also substantial differences. But I come more precisely to Eveline's question, and the term of association is not for the Saint-Simonians. They use it all the time, but it's not so absolutely sure that they always agree what they mean by it, and the definitions vary and the usages vary. But they use it on the one hand as a kind of counter concept to conflict and war. You know, kind of the idea, previously the nations have fought bloody wars, and we will replace this by a peaceful association of the different people. And this, of course, on the practical level many people, you may not know this, on the practical level, the Saint-Simonians later in their life, in the 30s and 40s, were very active in introducing the railway to France. And why should they do such a thing? About 10 years ago, there was an exhibition on the Saint-Simonian in the National Library, and you had different heads, the different leaders of the school, and across the poster was a railway train with fume coming out, steam coming out. Why should they be interested in that? Because they thought if you create the means of communication, you will lead to peaceful association, cooperation. People will know each other better and they will not lead wars. It is, of course, somewhat an idealistic idea. And then beginning in 1870, French-German war, you see the railways being used to transport soldiers to the front. But the idea was different. The idea was this will bring people together and they will have rather peaceful association and less wars. Then, of course, association is also used against a counter term against competition. And there we come closer to kind of bourgeois, capitalist, liberal economy. They also thought, you know, all this competition and they cut each other's throat. It might be replaced by peaceful cooperation, association. So you see the term was widely used. Gans looks at this and he says, yes, first of all, people have to have the right to assemble freely and to organize themselves. And he says, in France, there have been situations when this was forbidden, when each auto-organization, each association needed to be allowed beforehand and so on. And he says, this is no good. They have to have the right to organize themselves, to unite themselves. Otherwise, the entrepreneurs, the owners of the industry can impose their will as far as salaries and working conditions are concerned. So the term is, if you look at it, there is a good 20th century edition of the Doctrine de Saint-Simon, faite par Bouglet and Halevi, both quite bright chaps. In the earlier part of the 20th century, they have pages of notes on the concepts of the Saint-Simonians, and they agree that the association is not so clear as a term in them. But what is then interesting, what Gans makes of it, and he tries, I think, Hegel too, he did not want to be the corporations like closed medieval guilds. He's against that. He wanted the possibility to open and you can have social mobility and so on. But with Gans, I think it goes further to organize the working man so that they can have articulate and demand their interests. And I think, yes, that Gans came to this idea. He does not say it so explicitly, but when you read closely what he says, I think what you ask yourself, well, what can he have in mind? And you say, well, this is like a trade union.
So, thank you again, Professor Norbert. Now we have also Emmanuel that wants to make a question to you. So I hand over to Emmanuel.
Yes. So thank you, Norbert, Waszek, for the presentation.
You've all heard it before, I remember.
I have two questions. The first one is something like Evelini have already posed the question. It is about, I was reading now the book from Schmidt and Busch, Religiöse Hingabe oder soziale Freiheit. And he writes there that Gans was critical from the Association Universelle, from the Saint-Simonist. He says that I will speak in German. Die Association Universelle ist für Gans ein Ort der Zerstörung des Einzelnen als eines selbstbestimmten Individuums. I think it is interesting how, and you say in your presentation how Edward Gans took this idea from association and transformed in an idea from Vergesellschaftung.
Yes, but you may have not. You continue if you haven't finished yet.
Yes, no, my question is, I think it is interesting how the Hegelian took some utopic ideas and not direct disapproving these ideas, but try to transform in something more rational in the system. And my question is, we can see in the Hegelian something like an example how we need to deal with utopic ideas.
Well, thank you. With Schmidt and Busch, of course, I've known him for a very long time. We often discuss this. We do not always agree. That's like it, but like it goes. But of course, I'm not ignoring that many things separate the Hegelians and the Saint-Simonians. That is for me obvious. What is for me more interesting is where they come together. And you know, you mentioned too that, and I may come back to that, that the Hegel uses, Gans uses the term association, and then so there, as a, you know, you can say that as a Fremdwort in German, you can use it in English and in French, no problem. But then he uses also German Vergesellschaftung. And donc there you see that he's taking the concept association over, but he's already playing with it, and he's bringing out the sense of the word that he would like to use. Alors, utopian thought, well, the French socialists, you know, it was Marx who said these are utopian socialists on the Marxist tradition rather, and to be so that they could present themselves as scientific, wissenschaftlicher Sozialismus. So it's in a way a pejorative label that is stuck on the Saint-Simonians and on Fourier and on others. Well, for Hegel, you know, he always tried not to be utopian, but in some cases, he goes beyond. He does not stick himself to the to the rule that he had set out in the preface of the Philosophy of Right, only what is and so on. He does go beyond it. I'll give you one example that is not so far away from the Saint-Simonians. Paragraph 198 on the division of labor in the Philosophy of Right, where he says, and then man can step aside and let the machine do this unpleasant work. I mean, isn't that a bit utopian? Utopian. So it's not always excluded from Hegel's whole horizon, even though he tries to limit. He does not want to be accused as somebody who is building castles in the air or something. But from time to time, there are glimpses of a future in Hegel, even though he is trying to minimize them. But it's a complicated question how Hegel can deal with the future and so on. But, you know, there are always some passages that are often quoted when about America and about Russia, and it gives kind of glimpses of the future. Is that utopian? It's at least a look forward in history. How it depends how much you make of it then in the end.
Thank you, Professor Norbert. Now we have also Poliana that is wanting to make a question, so I will hand over to her.
Thank you, Ricardo. Thank you, Professor Waszek, for the excellent lecture and exposition. I've been following your work for a while now, and this is a thematic, this is a research field I am very interested in. Hegel's school, young Hegelians, the intellectual life before Mars Revolution, the influence of the French socialists' ideas on the young Hegelians. So I'm very interested in. And my first question, I have two questions. So my first question is related to the understanding we have of Hegel's school and the separation we do or we make between young and old Hegelians. So Michael Heinrich, in his biography of Karl Marx from 2018, I think it was published, he argued that it doesn't make much sense, this distinction we made between young Hegelians and old Hegelians or left and right Hegelians. And to be honest, I don't have the book here with me at my home, and it has been a while now since I read it. But as far as I can reconstruct Heinrich's arguments, and if I'm doing any mistake, I apologize by that in advance. But as far as I can remember, it has something to do with the fact that the ones we usually understand as the that are representing these parties, right and left Hegelians, they would not really have a strong identity to offer or a common program, or they wouldn't have enough common points that would allow us to classify them as belonging to one or another party or exclude them from one or another party. So I'd like to know if your point of view in this issue, in this question, and I'd like to know what would be the essential aspects for you which would allow us to characterize the young Hegelians. For example, you spoke about a few, among them Edward Gans is really a greatest one. So what would allow us to make a distinction between these guys, the left Hegelians and the right Hegelians? And then I come to my second question, because in my opinion, we can speak about young Hegelians, especially when we say that, well, especially from the Restoration period on until the 30s, the 40s in Germany. They are the ones that insist in those aspects of Hegel's conception of the state and political philosophy, that they insist in those aspects that Hegel's defends and which are not reality yet. They are not Wirklichkeit yet. So Hegel defends certain aspects of political life, political state, and I think the young Hegelians, they are the ones who insist, look, there are a few things, important things, crucial things that are not yet verwirklicht, accomplished in the German state right now. So I think this is an essential point for me. But I'd like to know if you think that any of them, Edward Guns, for instance, or others, really had hope that the full accomplishment of the modern state, this rule of law, the Rechtsstaat, it could offer real solutions to the problems of poverty, to the problems of the rebel, to these economical contradictions which seems to appear or to be made stronger from or with the ascent of capitalist mode of production. Because I think this is the point, this is Marx's point of view, that the full accomplishment of modern state is exactly what would allow this capitalist working relations, this capitalist economics relations to get even stronger, so it would not stop them. And in my opinion, these capitalist relations are in opposite to Hegel's corporations, Saint-Simon's associations, but this is another point. So I just would really appreciate, what are your thoughts about this this question, that the fact that maybe modern state would, the accomplishment of modern state would not make a stop to these contradictions, but it would make it stronger. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you, Poliana. Very good questions, both of them. I'll begin with the second one, where I think I can be shorter, and then I come back to the Hegel school and left and right and young and old Hegelians. I think you understood, as you understand it, it's quite perfect. In Hegel's philosophy of right, you see that he's arguing for a constitution, important political debate also at the time. Prussia had no written constitution. And so he's saying, the constitution is according to reason, it's what the time asks for, and so on and so on. But of course, the constitution never came. The king had promised a constitution on several occasions already when he was trying to rally the Prussians against Napoleon. And then later on, I'll give you a constitution once this is finished, and then he forgot about it. Of course, it remains Lübbe. The old Lübbe gives a nice term. He says Hegel was living in relativer politischer Versöhnung. Il espérait que la constitution viendra, the constitution would come. And so he could, in a way, live in peace with Prussian monarchy. Of course, as things dragged on, another 10 years, the disciples of Hegel, they could not remain at that position. A constitution, we've been waiting for so long, it didn't come. So they become to get louder. They begin to ask, they begin to organize themselves. One of the first in German who wrote about parties, political parties is Rosenkranz. It's all forgotten, but it's already in Rosenkranz, and then that we need to organize us in political parties to achieve a constitution. And in Gans, it becomes the demand for a constitution. I'm only mentioning the constitution because it was already a debated issue at the time. I could have chosen other examples, but the constitution shows that the disciples tried to be more outspoken, tried to demand explicitly the constitution, whereas in Hegel, it's kind of a patient wait for a bit longer. It will come. It's already almost there. I'm exaggerating a bit, but so in a way, the Hegelians thought that things might become better and that the constitution would improve the situation in Prussia and elsewhere when you have defined rights for everyone. Okay, I come back to your first question because there I have much more to say. And so both terms, Hegelian left, Hegelian right, and then the second one, young and old Hegelians, well, they came a bit from the outside, these terms. They were kind of labels. This is particularly true with young and old Hegelians, because the first to use it is Heinrich Leo, who came as a critic, the Hegelingen, a kind of critique of the Hegel school. And there he uses young Hegelian to kind of distinguish it from the master Hegel, the old man, who was much more reasonable chap. So they tried to, he uses it as a pejorative, critical label that he scotches them onto them. And but you find that some of them, like Bauer in the Posaune already, takes the thing over, which is something that often happens. You get a label that was meant critically, but the people in a way accept it as they go along. And what you might find useful, it's an older book by Henning Ottmann, Hegel im Spiegel der Interpretationen, etc. I think he has several good points about Hegel's school and how we can explain this. The problem is, in fact, that what was used from the outside, even with Strauss, certainly he was a Hegelian in the beginning, but when he uses these terms, links, Zentrum, rechts, for the Hegelian school, he is trying to classify the people that have reacted to his life of Jesus. So it's also a bit from the outside, and in fact, for Strauss, it's a bit ironical, which many readers haven't noticed. But to kind of impose the structure of French Parliament on Hegel's school, it was a bit ironical. Anyway, what Ottmann says critically is that when you have, in German, very important, the 2 volumes edited by Löwit and Lübbe in the early 1960s, Die Hegelsche Linke, Die Hegelsche Rechte. That was, of course, there are good collections and you find interesting texts in it, but the problem is that the naive reader will think if this one is in volume of the right Hegelians, he must be to the right. Why is this not so? Because Hegel's school lasted for a long time. It is not reasonable to assume that as they were organizing themselves politically, let's say in 1830, that it would always remain like that. Even the individual figures turned from time to time, developed and went from right to left and back to right, like Bruno Bauer. So for me, it doesn't really make much sense to say he's a left Hegelian, he's a right Hegelian. You would always have to add at what point in time, and often you would also have to add in which debate. Someone like Strauss could be very to the left wing on the theological side, critique of religion and so on. And then when it comes to political life, he's not so left wing at all. So you see, even the individuals, or Bruno Bauer, who came from the right to the left, and then at the end of his life, he turned again to the right. So even for an individual, it's difficult to say, is he a right-wing Hegelian? It always depends on the circumstances. What year are we speaking of about, and what issue is at stake? You can always, if you have one question, you will have different answers. So I tend to think one should not use these labels too much. I mean, when we are sort of kind of discussing freely, we can say he's a left Hegelian, yes, because he shares the main left-wing views. Okay, but if you look at it more strictly, you will see it is complicated. It might differ from one point to the other. So what I'm in favor of, you have really to reconstruct the great debates within the Hegelian school. You know, you have debates about aesthetics, you have debates about theology, obviously, you have debates about political constitution and so on. And according to the debates you look at, you will arrive at new classifications. It's not that once you have someone put into volume 1 and he's a right Hegelian, that he will always remain there. Is that clear? Is that where I'm driving at? So I think Ottman, it's not many pages in his book, but he has reasonable things to say about that. It's already an old book. I think it was his thesis, Hegel im Spiegel der Interpretation, and something like 1977. But yes, it is also what is interesting is that these labels come from the outside, and then only a bit later they're taken up, and Bruno Bauer begins to speak of young Hegelians himself. Okay.
Thank you, Norbert.
Thank you very much, Norbert. Now we have some questions in the chat. We are already a quarter to 5 here in Brazil, a bit late in Paris. So maybe we'll not.
It's okay. Let me just go somewhere for a minute.
Okay. So I was just about to say, only to explain that we don't know if we'll have enough time to ask the both formulated questions, but we, if it's not possible, we will forward the ones that we can make to Professor Norbert afterwards.
Maybe I can take the opportunity just to remember the ones who are watching us that we have made available the links to the websites with the next meetings we have for the next month. So the ones that are interested, you can just check it in the chat of Teams.
So nice.
Excuse me, I just had to attend to something, but I'm willing to take other questions. We are under curfew. I can't go out anyway. If there are more questions, don't hesitate.
Okay, I will read then the question of your friend Hernandez Eichenberger. And Hernandez also translated has also translated an article of Professor Norbert Waszek and published that in an issue of our online Hegelian studies. If I'm not mistaken myself, it is from 2018. So I read it. Hello, Professor Waszek. Here is Hernandez Eichenberger. It is always good to hear you. I have one question. The question of poverty is not new in political thought, but Hegel thought of the problem of poverty in its own way, as an immanent result of bourgeois society. In your article, Saint-Simonism und Hegelianismus, you argue that the strength of Hegel's response to the problem concerns his Realismus und pragmatische Flexibilität. In other words, Hegel did not answer this problem in a unique and definitive way, but he posed the question broadly and comprehensively. How do you assess the importance of this idea of immanent poverty caused by the very dynamics of society with regard to this exchange of ideas between Hegel and these groups that we could call proto-socialists?
Thank you, Herr Hernandez. Nice to hear from you. Hegel does not really use the term social question, but the term emerges shortly after and is used then by several people and so on, becomes that is as far as the German is concerned. But Hegel, in a way, anticipates the use of the term because he already identifies the crucial problems in this civil society, which will also pave for him the way to go on to the further sections, cooperation, and so on. So I think it is right to say that, of course, the question of poverty has always occupied great philosophers. The poor will always be with you is already in the Bible, and of course in all different periods of world history you will find the issue of poverty. But what Hegel spells out is a kind of, and what will emerge with the concept of the social question, is that quantitatively and qualitatively this question of poverty is on a more significant level, whereas you can have hunger crisis in the Middle Ages because the crops failed in agriculture. You can have, I shall say, contingent facts and developments that will lead to poverty and so on. But with Hegel, of course, the poverty is no longer contingent. It's not created by something that happens once and will disappear by itself, but is systematically produced by this kind of society. So in this sense, I think he is extremely forward-looking and innovative. Then, of course, the question, what does he have to say? What does he provide us with answers? Well, when I said, and Hernandez was quoting from there, is that I said Hegel is pragmatic in the sense of he's not looking for an overall recipe that will deal with all the problems forever. But he is trying to do as best as he can to point towards several solutions. Some of them he discusses critically. But the point of the article that Hernandez kindly translated about the Scottish beggars, in paragraph 245 of the Philosophy of Right, Hegel has this remark about Scotland. And many readers, even favorable readers like Shlomo Avineri, who is very favorable towards Hegel, he says, at no point does Hegel leave a problem like that. It's not answered, it's not resolved. How untypical of him. And some have gone as far as to say it is cynicism. And then what I tried to do is I thought, yeah, if there is a precise reference like that, especially in Scotland, as he says in the text, he must have thought of something. So I was trying to look for what he might have had in mind. And then it is not so cynical, although it may not be a perfect solution to all the problems of society. That's why I kind of modestly tried to say he is pragmatic. He's not pretentious and say, I come with the answer, follow me. He's more modest in that respect. So the point I was trying to make today, and also in the book, Hegelianism and Saint-Simonism, is that because the answer was not so perfect and not, Hegel does not seem completely convinced himself, because he says this question will continue to torment us, something like that. Das Quälende. Donc you think he was himself in doubt whether he had solved the questions to his satisfaction. This is the point where obviously the Hegel's disciple would be open and would be listening to other suggestions. That's why and how, I think, they got interested in people like Saint-Simon. Now, maybe they wanted to go beyond Hegel, with Hegel, but beyond Hegel. And that's why they turned to kind of alternatives. Maybe we need new ideas, they must have thought, and we go elsewhere. Maybe we find some inspiration.
Thank you, Norbert, again for this answer, for all your patience. We are now considering our time frame limitation. Have to come to an end. I see that there is some comments here in the chat, but unfortunately we can't now transform these comments into questions. We will have to really be strict to the time. So I would like to really say that we are going to close the chat now, and I would like also to ask the attendees that now we are not receiving questions any longer. So I hope that this is just one more chapter of our cultural and intellectual transfer, Norbert, that we can still make other events together, have other opportunities to discuss your work and to debate with you. I, in behalf of the organizing committee, and I should also add to the organizing committee, Professor Fabio Nolasco. I really forgot to mention his name in the beginning, but he is also a member of the organizing committee. He is probably also watching us now. So in behalf of the organizing committee, I would like to thank again very much Professor Norbert Waszek for joining us here today for this great exposition. I will also like to thank all our colleagues that joined us per Teams or Facebook. We really appreciated your participation. I would like to also address a special thank to all the technical support and the support teams that was today here with us, Andressa and also Marcel. Thank you very much. And now I will just Mateus, sorry, Mateus. So I would like now to see if Emmanuel, Poliana, and Eveline would like to say some last words to Professor Norbert and also to our attendees. So I hand over to Emmanuel.
Yes, I just want to thank you again, Norbert, for the presentation, for the discussion, and to thank you also Mateus and Andressa, also Poliana for the organization, Eveline to discuss with us, and also thank you for the people that was watching us. Yes.
Very nice to see you all, and I'm very happy to see that you're all well, and stay in contact, stay in touch.
Okay, Poliana, do you want to say some words?
Yeah, I'd like once again to say thank you to Professor Waszek. It was a pleasure to have you with us here today in these special conditions, but still it was really good, the exposition. I'd like to thank my colleagues of the organizing committee. We forgot also Professor Inácio Helfer, not just Fábio and Waszek. Also Inácio Helfer, who is organizing this with us. I'd like to thank the colleagues that joined us here through Teams, also through Facebook. We appreciate the interest, the questions you have made. And also I'd like to thank the technical team, Andressa, Mateus, Diego, Samuel, who helped us with the Facebook transmission. I'd just like to remind that we are soon uploading this video to our YouTube channel. So we have a YouTube channel of the journal. And for us who would like to check the last meeting we had, the last event with Lisa Herzog, the video is already available. We will also add Portuguese subtitles soon, I hope. And I'd like to remember you that the next event will be in, just checking, in November with Professor 7th of November at 3 p.m. Brazil's time, and 7 p.m. in France, Germany, 6 p.m. in United Kingdom. So you are all invited, and I hope you can join us for this and other events. Thank you, everyone, for the participation, the interest, and I hope to see you soon.
Now we go for a virtual drink.
Yeah, that's it. Coffee at Skype.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Waszek. Thank you. Bye. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.